behalf of Center for the Study of Exotic Societies, let me welcome you all for this Rajni Kothari lecture. Let me also take the opportunity to welcome Professor Alfred Stepan, today who is speaking on the topic Theravada Buddhist Puzzle, why Inclusionary Founding Doctrines and Exclusionary Contemporary Politics. Rajni Kothari lecture was instituted in the honor of CSDS founder director Professor Rajni Kothari. The earliest speaker in the series has been Professor Charles Douglas Lummis, Ramin Jahanbegloo, Sudipta Kaviraj, Gananath Obeysekere, Rounaq Jahan, Abdellah Hammoudi, Charles Taylor, Arif, Dirlik, and Shahid Amin. Professor Rajiv Bhargav has kindly agreed to chair today's lecture. May I request Professor Rajiv Bhargav to introduce today's speaker and chair.
Thank you, Sanjay, and it's a real privilege for me to chair this lecture and to welcome and introduce Professor Alfred Stepan. Al is currently Professor of Government at Columbia University and was previously the Gladstone Professor of Government at Oxford University and also a Fellow of All Souls College there. He was the first rector and president of Central European University, Budapest. He has won several awards, including the Karl Deutsch Award given by the International Political Science Association in comparative politics. This award he got in 2012. He has written extensively, and his work has been translated into over a dozen languages. Among his books are the path-breaking work on problems of democratic transition and consolidation in Southern Europe, South America, and post-communist Europe, a book that he authored with Juan Linz, his longtime colleague and friend. He's also written a book, several other books, including Arguing Comparative Politics, The Military in Politics, Changing Patterns in Brazil, The State and Society, Peru in Comparative Perspective, and Crafting State Nations, India and Other Multinational Democracies, that he co-authored with Juan Linz and our own Yogendra. I might sound a bit hyperbolic, but I mean every word of what I'm going to say. That was a formal introduction, but I'm going to give a brief informal introduction to Al. He is one of the most politically engaged academics that I know. Engaged is one word that strikes one when one encounters Al's considerably formidable scholarship. But there are two other words that come to your mind. One is assiduous, and the other is enthusiastic. He's very, very enthusiastic. He has a commitment to creative inquiry that is manifest simultaneously in head, heart, and gut. He has an insatiable appetite for fieldwork, a massive repertoire of curiosity and patience to listen to all kinds of people, to ordinary citizens, local political workers on one hand, and on the other, bureaucrats, military generals, prime ministers, presidents. He actually goes and meets everybody. And the rich and multi-layered knowledge that he's managed to generate of the many countries to which he's devoted. India is one of them, but he's deeply, deeply interested in India. And the enormous comparative insights that he pours out all the time is simply breathtaking. He's lured by the magic of numbers, and his childlike delight at number-based evidence is infectious. But there's hidden in him a perennially young political ethnographer that makes his work deeply context-sensitive, and without which Al knows that his work would have been considerably more diminished. I could go on and on to give you a rich flavor of some of his work, but I don't think I would like to stand between you and him. May I now invite Al to come and deliver the Rajni Kothari lecture.
Raji, only a very good friend and colleague could give such uncritical introduction. And he's a very good friend. It's very uncritical introduction. Thank you very much. And I thank all of you for coming at the end of a super hot week and a difficult time. It's lovely to have you here. And I'm very honored to be here as in the capacity as a Rajni Kothari lecturer. Because when you think of what he contributed, and if you've seen him, given my thoughts on this, it's an amazing thing that he did as an intellectual and created this institute. When I saw the list of speakers at your golden anniversary, it was really quite extraordinary. I mean, so many wonderful people, good people and great thinkers. Sudipta, Kaviraj, and Chuck Taylor, and Arif from Turkey. I mean, you have in Latin America we call it poder convocatorio. That means the power to convoke people to a place for an agenda. CSDS has poder convocatorio. You can invite people and they come. And they know that it's going to be important and it's an agenda. And that's a great form of political power and intellectual power. And one of the things I work a lot with that made me even understand more about the CSDS would happen to be my work with Yogendra and therefore Lakhniti and Santry. My co-author, Lummis, is actually the founder of many things over a 40-year period. He recently died. But as the co-author, he worked a lot with Yogendra and talked with Yogendra and asked a lot of questions about Lakhniti and CSDS. And every time Yogendra would leave, Juan would say, you know, I think I want to hear more about this Lakhniti. I want to hear more about CSDS because I think they put together the most original and important news survey organization in the last 30 years in the world. And Juan won the Lifetime Award from Wait For It. He created the world values, he created the Euro values. So that was really a serious statement. And he liked the type of questions he did, the type of questions, the audacity to change questions if you don't feel they're rich enough. A lot of people just stay with their old questions. And the fact that you're using 17 languages because you need to do it. And so someplace like the Michigan survey, at one time you had a survey of 27,000 and their survey was about 2,700. They had 3 languages and you had 17. Well, this says something about your commitment and the quality, and that's why my home in India for over a decade has always been CSDS. Okay, my talk. The Buddha is often associated with the doctrinal rejection of violence. A Buddhist convert in India and a close follower of the Buddha, Emperor Asoka, in the 2nd century BCE, became the first major ruler in world history to observe violence and instead to make a rational persuasion and not merely tolerance, but as Rajiv says in various articles, respect for all religions central to his reign, to his overall argument. Now, thus when Theravada Buddhist Ceylon, Burma, and Thailand were some of the very few developing countries in Asia, Africa, North Africa, to become democracies. And at one time, Ceylon, the 2 highest ranked democracies in that entire world for a very long time were India and some Theravada Buddhist Ceylon. But many people said, you know, if you have to bet on one of them making it in the long haul, it's going to be Ceylon, because they have higher educational levels, they're richer, and probably Theravada Buddhism is going to be a better thing than India's mixture of Hinduism and Islam. Well, it didn't turn out that way. I mean, many people observed really felt that Theravada Buddhism itself contributed to this record because not only Ceylon, but Burma and Thailand were some of the very few developing countries ranked very highly as democracies in this period. Now, however, the longer democracy continued, and the more elections returned political power, the more violence increased in Ceylon, and also in Burma and Thailand. In all three of the Theravada Buddhist countries, the ethno-religious-linguistic majority ended up in violent civil wars with their minority population. Estimates of the total deaths are as high as 500,000 in Burma. I don't necessarily accept that, but one of the most authoritative writers gives a big argument why it's 500,000. It was 110,000 in Ceylon by the time the war ended. And the new war in the three southernmost provinces in Thailand has already killed 8,000 people. So, what explains this puzzle of the Buddha's and the Shuka's non-violent and inclusionary founding doctrines, but violent and exclusionary contemporary politics? Especially, why and how did this violence contribute to democratic breakdowns the longer elections were held? Now, in my research to date, I do not find that Theravada Buddhism by itself is the reason for the violence and democratic breakdowns. Or that it had to be so, and that it always will be so. Rather, in my lecture today, I will seek to demonstrate how, in all three countries, a socially constructed version of Theravada Buddhism, in interaction with the values of two additional variables, both directly related to majority-minority relations, goes a long way towards unraveling our puzzle of inclusion and peaceful founding doctrine, but exclusion and violent contemporary politics. The three interacting variables that, if I have time, I'll try and explore tonight are, first, what I call religious multivocality. Second, nation-state building policies, as opposed to state-nation building policies, in societies that are de facto plurinational and deeply diverse polities. And the third variable I call political eras and political regimes. Now, before we go on any further with Theravada Buddhism, let me first say a word about, contrast it with Mahayana Buddhism. I'm not an expert on this, but I keep thinking about, and I'm still very much working, and I haven't solved the puzzle, I've solved part of the puzzle. But Theravada Buddhism, for sociological and demographic reasons, is available as a core building block of exclusionary nationalism, whereas Mahayana Buddhism is less available. Theravada Buddhism is practiced primarily in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, where in all of these countries it's the absolute majority. But Mahayana Buddhism is practiced mainly in Greater China, South Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, and it's not the majority religion in any of these countries. Furthermore, and I don't fully understand this, but it's a fact, adherents of Mahayana Buddhism, again and again in surveys, say that they practice 2 or 3 different major world religions. And so that they are quite at ease with the idea of having multiple but complementary religious identities and having multiple religious practices. I think this works against the idea that, in addition to the fact you're not majority, it works against majoritarianism. And also, Theravada Buddhists, in almost all cases, for a very long time, had Buddhist kings that were supported by the Sangha, the clerical group, and they supported each other. They mutually legitimated each other. And you didn't get, this situation didn't exist in the Mahayana Buddhism. Okay, now having said this, I think that I want to further back away and say right up front that Theravada Buddhism, in my judgment, has, as many religions do, more than one version. And that's been socially constructed in a fairly persuasive way and won a lot of adherents. I'm going to call, so just like we need new approaches in social science to religion and secularism, which now emphasizes multiple secularisms. New approaches to religion and politics must emphasize the multivocality of all religions. Now, let us focus a bit on the religious multivocality variable. Now, obviously, all religions are multivocal, but they have some practices and mentalities that are potentially usable for the social creation of nonviolent and even democratic politics, especially if an influential version of this religion has been socially constructed a discourse that's inclusive, pluralist, and tolerant. However, the same religion can have a group of people that socially constructs a very different version. And they may coexist for a very, very long time. So the question of religion itself it normally can't explain very much. Now, Theravada Buddhism is an especially dramatic case of multivocality, indeed of two quite different versions of the same religion. For short, I will call these contrasting ideal types, inner ideal types. Theravada Buddhism 1, TV1, and Theravada Buddhism 2, TV2. Theravada Buddhism 1 is inclusionary, tolerant, and more universal version of Buddhism based on the chemical writings of the Buddha and the story of the Buddhist king Asoka. TV2 is more exclusionary, intolerant, and nationalistic version, particularly nationalistic version, so it's less universal and more nationalistic version of Theravada Buddhism. To be sure, TV1 contains elements of social construction and reification. Indeed, Tessa Bartholomeus terms it an imagined ultra-Pacific Buddhism. But on balance, the ideal type of TV1 seems much closer to the original teaching of the Buddha than TV2. I don't need to belabor to an audience such as this some of the inclusionary aspects of the Buddha and the Asoka. I'll just say that one was the absence of dogmatism. And the Buddha said in a major discourse, do not go by oral tradition, by lineage of teaching, by a collection of texts, but what you know for yourselves. But when you know for yourselves, these things are wholesome, these things are blameless, these things, if undertaken and practiced, lead to welfare and happiness, then you should engage them. So he discounts priest, text, books. It's personal experience and rational. It's openness to all. Buddhist preaching in India again and again involved arguments against exclusionary privileging of Brahmins and for the inclusion of all people of whatever caste in all secular and sacred activities, whether it's local governance or making fire for sacred rituals. He stressed a lot respecting different religions. He cautioned his followers in many sermons against hostile behavior towards previous religion by urging them to respect all shrines. And to be cautious about being absolutely certain that their thoughts on religion are true. The Buddha argued that, quote, it is not proper for a wise man who preserves truth to come to a definite conclusion. Only this is true. Anything else is wrong. The Buddha also, the Buddha also obviously rejected violence. In only one of his discourses does he accept any type of violence. When he was asked, what is the one thing, Buddha, whose killings you approve? The Buddha answered, having slain anger, one does not sorrow. The killing of anger in oneself. So that's the only type of killing that he's ever legitimated. Asoka's contributed to this Theravada Buddhism 1 by the fact that he was an emperor, but most importantly, as Rajiv has recently said in various articles, he really went beyond the normal use of the word toleration, which means to allow someone to continue doing something even though you actually dislike them and you have the capacity to stop them. So this type of tolerance doesn't imply any respect, whereas in Asoka, it's actually in Rajiv's argument, it goes beyond simple toleration to imply respect for other religions. For example, in in Rocky 12, he says, Ashoka says that the fates of others all deserve to be honored. And he says that again and again. And concord alone is commendable. So we put this up on the edicts, we put it on the rock pillars, and he really meant you can travel anywhere. So there's a lot of, Rajiv argues, ethnic cleansing that was going on. So he was speaking against it. Okay, now let's examine the social construction of the exclusionary, intolerant, and very nationalistic version of Theravada Buddhism that we'll call TB2. Now, the social construction of TB2 was facilitated by a historical fact. Ashoka's edicts on toleration and interreligious respect are an essential component of what we now understand as TB1. However, while the pillar edicts as sculptural works of art endured, as works of political philosophy and ethical persuasion, they virtually disappeared from human consciousness. The first translations of the pillar edicts on respect don't happen until about 1837, and the first direct attribution of Ashoka as the author of one of them is probably in about 1923. And then so for much of the discourse, Ashoka is actually seen as a very different Ashoka. He's utilized in Ceylon as someone who is a proselytizer for Buddhism, sends his son to convert it, and implicitly only sees the island for being Lankas. So it's an amazingly wrong, unusual interpretation of Ashoka, but of the Buddha, and Ashoka, but it's a major interpretation in Ceylon. Now, there's a 6th century chronicle, Mahavamsa. This is taken by many Sri Lankans, despite its mythological character, to be the major history of the origins, values, and goals of Buddhism in Ceylon. To the extent that this is so, this chronicle subverts many of the core doctrines of TB1 and helps to explain part of our puzzle. Let me just give some ideas of it. The opening chapter of Mahavamsa, the Buddha is referred to frequently as the conqueror, who flew to Lanka 3 times to win Lanka for the faith. The Buddha confronted the pre-human Nagas and struck terror to their hearts until they were overwhelmed by fear. This passage, far from emphasizing the universal and peaceful character of the Buddhist doctrine, stresses that Lanka, Ceylon, was only for the Ceylonese people and was brought to the island by a conqueror, the Buddha. Even though the Buddha insisted in his entire life that he had no supernatural powers, in the Mahavamsa, he is depicted as flying over, hovering in the air and flying over from India 3 times. Now, a central message, probably the most important message in Mahavamsa, is chapter 25 of the Chronicle, the victory of Dutrakavani. This chapter depicts the conquest of the Hindu Tamils by the Buddhist king, and to prepare for this battle, the Buddhist king carries a spear with a relic of the Buddha. More, he recruits 500 monks to lead his army. So he's going into a war with a relic, with a spear with a relic of the Buddha, 500 monks in the front. And then later, when he kills 60,000 Tamils, in a key passage, 6 Arahants, enlightened Buddhist saints, consoled him, quote, that this deed raises no hindrance on our way to heaven. Only 1.5 human beings have been slain, here by thee, O Lord of men. All the rest were unbelievers and men of evil life, not more to be esteemed than beasts. But for thee thou wilt bring glory to the doctrine of the Buddha in manifold ways. Take comfort. Now these passages are repeat, and they're the most important doctrines inside of Ceylon. Many people say it's in the history. Many people think it's a history of their country. These passages are complete with a triumph of writing of nationalistic history over Buddhist TB1 type more universal doctrines. The Ceylonese Arahants confronted the remorseful king with a theory of just war. Obviously, Buddha had no theory of just war. Moreover, Buddha taught the respect of all life, and he would have been appalled that of the nearly 60,000 slain Hindu Tamils should be no more respected beasts, and only 1.5 were human beings. Now, Theravada Buddhism traces its origin to Ceylon. This image of a conquering Buddhism, in which Theravada Buddhists have a privileged place and quality, spread to Burma and Thailand. Indeed, in the earliest extant history of Burma, the 1530 Chronicle, written by a Burmese Buddhist monk, quote, "The vast majority of information about the history of Buddhism is drawn from the Ceylonese Mahavamsa." I also talked at length with two of the Buddhist thinkers who are considered the most, some of the best intellectuals of Buddhism in Thailand. Both of them said that in separate interviews that as late as the end of the 19th century, their most important understanding of Buddhism came through this Mahavamsa, and so it's really a doctrine that's traveled, unfortunately. However, I don't think it would be analytically or historically correct to argue that TB2 ever completely replaced TB1 in any of our countries. We could easily document that in all three countries the importance of Mahavamsa discourse for political reasons waxed and waned. For example, even in Ceylon, despite the availability of the Mahavamsa doctrine, style of anti-pluralism since the 6th century, it only emerged as a dominant discourse once the British came. In the context of colonialism, all of a sudden, this is a very usable discourse and a very powerful nationalist discourse against the British and thriving on an existentialist threat to the Buddhists in the country. Now, this brings us to our second explanatory variable, incentives and disincentives of majoritarian violence against minorities in different political contexts. And I call this the historical eras and political regimes variable. It makes analytic sense to conceptualize Theravada Buddhism as having three distinct historical eras, each with very different political regimes. The era of indigenous empires, the era of foreign colonialism and aspirant nation states, and the era of competitive democratic elections. Each of these political regimes became progressively less tolerant of minority nationalities and religions. Why? Now, there's strong theoretical and political reasons for a reasonable degree of tolerance in indigenous empires and kingdoms. And indeed there was in all three of them, relatively. Empires throughout history have often had tributaries composed of subunits whose languages and religions were different from the empire's core. Such subunits, as long as they gave some tribute to the empire, particularly can be allowed substantial autonomy concerning their religion, their language, and their traditional rulers. They can have kings. These subunits are not necessarily liked, but they are a sign of the empire's regional power, and a major incentive for toleration is that the empire believes this policy will deter rebellions in the subunit or any collaboration with the empire's geopolitical rivals. In the case of Thailand, a very important mandala for a very long time was Patane, where I've been twice recently. And this was Muslim, spoke a different language, they had a different religion. This was all right with the Senate as long as they were tributaries. There were many areas in Burma that were outside of the center, but they also were allowed great space as long as they gave they gave some tribute. And even in the case of Ceylon, you had a central kingdom that was important, but when Tambaya, who recently deceased, he described the Kandy Kingdom as, quote, surrounded by satellite principalities, and at the margins had even more autonomous tributary principalities. The king's authority waned as the town stretched further away from the capital. For Tambaya, these structures were conducive to a reasonable degree of tolerance because they, quote, allowed for and produced social and political processes that were flexible, accommodative, and inclusive. Now, when we go to colonial regimes, the incentive system begins to change quite drastically. For theory-based reasons, it also creates new disincentives for indigenous majorities to tolerate indigenous minorities. National independence movements in colonized countries often are built around claims concerning the paramount legitimacy of the majority indigenous culture. In the process, often as a reaction to the colonizers' attempts to divide and rule, the majority may become increasingly embittered at minorities, who they perceive as favored by the colonists, underminers of nationalism, or worse, as dangerous colonial collaborators. Even for countries not colonized, such as Thailand, the mere presence of expansionist colonial powers in their geopolitical space can create new incentives to eliminate previously tolerated autonomy of tributaries. The political era of colonialism by foreign nation states in Ceylon and Burma did indeed activate these types of claims. British policies towards Christian schools in Ceylon were particularly crucial in fanning Buddhist exclusionary nationalism. Much more than in India, where after the sobering events of 1857, British rule attempted to treat all religions relatively equally. In Ceylon, however, British rule tended to starkly privilege Protestant schools. For example, Christians with their missions and schools enjoyed, quote, a fully autonomous status, not available to them even in the United Kingdom. The Central School Commission was created in 1842, was packed with Christian ministers, but had no Buddhists. Until 1879, every grant-and-aid school in the entire country was a Christian school. For a variety of reasons, more Tamil Hindus than Sinhalese Buddhists went to these Christian schools. Learned English and entered British civil service examinations by competitive exams. In this context, many Sinhalese Buddhists increasingly began to act like a majority with a minority complex. This was the setting for the emergence of Buddhist revivalism. The key leader of this fundamentalist Mahavamsa-influenced TB2 type movement in the 1870s, Dharmapala, urged his followers, quote, to enter into the realms of our king, in spirit and try to identify yourself with the thoughts of that great king who rescued Buddhism and our nationalism from oblivion. Dharmapala repeatedly asserted to his followers that, quote, the country of the Sinhalese should be governed by Sinhalese. In the judgment of one of Sri Lanka's premier anthropologists, who we've had here, Obeysekere, Dharmapala saw the country as a seemingly Buddhist one, and there is hardly any place in it for minority Muslims and Tamils, and wanted to construct a nation on the basis of seemingly Buddhist identity. Now, this was really strong, but it's interesting, I don't have the time to go through it. This is reversed 2 or 3 times. One of the things why it gets reversed as a dominant discourse is the Sinhalese and the Tamils realize that if they work together against the British, they can be more powerful at ending colonialism. And they really quieted down this type of discourse. It shot up again in the first election, but in the second election, all the accounts of the election said that it was somewhat marginalized. And it was only re-emerged the third time by someone, Rounaq, who was really able to capture majoritarianism and existentialist threats, and we'll look at that. Burma fought World War II. Aung San, his army was really fundamentally recruited only of Buddhists who spoke the Dhamma language and were from the Dhamma ethnicity. They thought they were going to China, but of course they went to Japan. They came back with the Japanese. So the British and the Americans fought against them, and they recruited almost 100% ethnic minority army against it. So this is a really hard contestation between 2 ethnically based armies, and the military in Burma to this day falls into an easy discourse of totally treating all ethnic groups as non-nationalist and non-serious and a danger. And it has something to do in the colonial period itself. Now, when we go to the question of the third type of political regime, independent states with competitive democratic elections. The latter is correctly understood as a necessary condition for democracies. Less understood is why this type of political regime may create a new set of incentives and possibilities for majority intolerance minorities. The ethno-religious-linguistic majority, for the first time in a country's history, may be able to win sovereign political power on a clearly majoritarian political platform and impose a series of policies that possibly lead to ethnic conflict and violence. Now, this is not overdetermined to happen, but whether or not this happens depends to a great extent on the third variable, which involves demographic structures and political choices by majorities between accommodation or exclusion. If your country has one set of structures and made different choices, it's not going to be a problem. But if your country, and let me just say what I'm getting at here. I'm calling this variable nation-state policies and territorially concentrated minorities. My hypothesis here is that if you have in one country a French type of theory, ideal state, where there's one dominant nationality, it didn't exist even in France, but there was one, and you can aspire to one language, and you think that there's one history and one future history, then nation-state building and democracy building can be probably reinforcing objects. However, if you're doing nation-state building, one nation, in a context of territorially based pluralism, especially if some minorities are territorially based majorities in a significant part of the policy, if you then try nation-state building policies in that pluralistic context, you're just begging for conflict and civil war and democratic breakdown. Now, what actually happened in all of the Theravada Buddhism was two things. One, every single one of them has territorially based minorities or majorities. The case in, and this is in the northern part of Ceylon, the Tamils are about 90% of the population. And they've never been able to really vote. There's no devolution at all. And more than 85%, at least 80% of the people in the 3 southern provinces in Thailand speak Malay. They're Muslim, and they're told again and again by the military, we want you to be better Thais. And they say, we love to be good Thais. What do you want us to do? They say, well, we'd like you to have a culture that's Thai. And they say, well, what's the culture of Thai? Well, actually, the answer comes back to be Buddhist. They don't necessarily want to say, well, what else can we do? Well, you can interact with people more in a Thai way. So what should you do? Well, speak Thai. Well, they're never going to. And then the last thing is, in turn, what else should we do? Well, you should respect the king. We should have immense respect for the king. We really like the king. But you always worship another small king. They said, yeah, we have a lot of small kings. But they said, you have to eliminate that small king. So the 3 things that the army is asking when they're going around in southern Thailand is to do these 3 things, which are existentially extremely difficult. And something like that, I could go through all the countries, but what you get in all 3 of the countries is a mantra that I've heard more than 50 times. It'd be very boring, but if I want to have appendix, I'll have 50 quotations where people link together the mantra of nation, religion, and ethnicity. And that's really strong. So, but if in fact you've got territorially concentrated minorities or majorities, and you insist on following nation-state building policies, this is a real conflict. Now there are when you think of the other countries in the world that recognize that they have territorially based minorities or majorities, there's a repertoire of how you respond to that. You absolutely have a number of official languages. You have to. Other people are going to self-govern themselves if their own language isn't recognized. You really are very careful about recognizing any particular religion, because other people may, in a whole area, 85% of people may be a different religion than yours. And you then, if people are going to self-govern themselves, you then try and work out some form of devolution. And you also probably, the only country that hasn't done, I mean, this is a big package, but the countries, Belgium, Canada, Spain, India, all buy into the whole package. Federalism, multiple languages, no official religion, and parliamentarianism that is very important because it allows presidentialism produces an indivisible good of a president. There can only be one president in presidential. And that indivisible good means you can only have one ethnic group in the ruling government. And whereas parliamentarianism, as you well know here, can have up to, you've never, as far as I can see, you've never had less than 13 parties, or never more than 25 in the last 15 years in the government. Now this is just inconceivable if you have a presidential system. So you make all these options, all of which facilitated you handling this. And what's fascinating is that anytime anyone mentions any part of this repertoire, any part, they are denounced, trashed, and silenced. In Ceylon, in Myanmar, in Thailand. But it's a real problem, you know, that they don't respond to. Now, I'll go through some of the things. If you buy into this, we can just look at some of the fundamentals of citizenship, just like voting and enfranchisement. You can look at devolution. You can look at the question of religion and just see that each one of our three Theravada Buddhist countries has not used any part of the repertoire, but it's also caused them an amazing amount of conflict. So let's just, we'll go on one which is pretty amazing. The whole question of disenfranchisement and deportation. Alexis de Tocqueville, in his classic work, Democracy in America, asserted that there is no more invariable rule in the history of society. The further electoral rights are extended, the greater is the need and excitement. For each concession, the strength of the democracy increases. Concession follows concession, and no stop can be made short of universal suffrage. This judgment has become what is called covering law in political science. It means it's really right everywhere. And it's really one of our most powerful laws. Now, so this became a covering law. In his excellent new book on subnational authoritarianism in the United States, Edward Gibson cites this quote and in reference to the disenfranchisement of the southern blacks in the United States, in the USA. He concurs with the judgment that never before or since in a national democracy, absent a core regime change, has this feat been matched. The above arguments make the fact that all three of the Theravada Buddhist countries are some of the few countries in the world that have disenfranchised some voters from non-Buddhist minorities. It makes it more remarkable. One of the obvious reasons why a new democracy can be less tolerant of minorities than the party in colonial power is that the dominant ethnicity will normally have the power for the first time to pass electorally based majoritarian laws with a politically exclusive intent. In 1931, the United Kingdom granted all long-term residents, male, suffrage. This meant that many Ceylon Tamils in the north of the Kingdom of Jahan, since the 14th and 17th centuries, and even the upcountry Tamils, who many arrived for to work on plantations in the center of the island in the mid-19th century, voted in the elections of 1936 and voted in the elections of 1947. However, immediately after independence, citizenship became less inclusive. Questions about upland Tamil voting rights were raised in the Ceylonese parliament by Sinhalese Buddhist MPs who reactivated TV2 discourse. You can read, they publish the debates, and you can read it. It's amazing TV2 discourse. For example, one MP on the floor of Parliament insisted that owing to the Tamils, his constituents, quote, have nothing but dread for their future. They fear the extinction of their race, the disappearance of their religion, and their language, unquote. Note the politically motivated mantra of race, religion, and language here, and its linkage to existentialist threats Buddhists face. Similar mantras are repeated, as I said, again and again everywhere. Now, one politician, under 19, who when he was in Oxford wrote a paper on why Ceylon was a multinational country, decided after losing 2 elections that he was going to run with absolute majoritarianism. So he came up with the idea of Sinhalese now, that we're going to go immediately, if he wins, from a 3-language policy to a 1-language policy. And when he announced this, he said, I will say plainly that nothing will please me more than the last Indian leaving the shores of Ceylon. Now, within 1 year of independence, the first law disenfranchising upcountry Tamils was passed and put into effect. In 1946, 11.7% of Ceylon's population were upcountry Tamils, but by 1981, the census has never reported them as being larger than 5.5, so half of them are on the native. On their own or in coalition, often with Marxists, they played a role in 1/4 of all the seats in the first parliament. But after their disenfranchisement, Tamils did not win a single seat in any of the 5 general elections, upcountry Tamils, in any of the 5 general elections from 1956 to 70, and were no longer a significant player in Ceylonese politics. In direct response to the disenfranchisement, the Jaffna-based Tamils for the first time began talking about federalism and decentralization more. Now, conflicts about disenfranchisement and deportation, quite salient in Burma. 200,000 Indians were disenfranchised and only had 2 or 3 days to leave in 1962 when the military came in, with only their movable baggage. But the most salient issue of disenfranchisement and deportation, of course, is the question of with the Rohingya. Now, there's no doubt that many Muslims have come illegally to Rohingya in the last few decades from Bangladesh. Nonetheless, there's also substantial historical evidence that before 1824, there was a large Muslim minority in the thriving Arakan kingdom. Numerous coins with Islamic references, and scriptural citations and headstones in Islamic graveyards and mosques with clear inscriptions of stone are dated before 1824. I'm stressing 1824 because a really nasty law was passed by the military in 1982, is that the only way, if you're not listed as an official Burmese race, is if you can document with birth certificates all your ancestors before the first British arrived in 1824. Now, given the fact that these are some of the poorest people in the whole country, the fact that police have routinely come through and Buddhists and just destroyed their homes and so on, the idea that some of these people are going to have the documentation of all of their ancestors, you're basically, it's an act of disenfranchisement by passing a law that you can't really do with. Okay, you can't really compete with. Okay, I'll skip to the question of majoritarian attacks on minority languages. And once this language is, once under 1901, whether campaign, the 1956 election campaign changed Ceylon forever, because he really campaigned that this is your language, and if this is the only language, people who speak this language are going to be the school teachers, people who teach this language are going to win the examinations, people who speak this language will play a more politically powerful role, and will marginalize people who should be citizens anyway. Okay, now this, he won it with huge support of Buddhist monks. Partly the Buddhist monks, when we think of them as a political actor, they have some special advantages. They're not supposed to be married, and they're not supposed to have a job. They're full-time available to campaign if you make something in their interest, and they believe it's in their interest. They believe this was in their interest, that this was going to change schooling, get rid of the majority of the minority complex. So the shift towards majoritarian was so amazing that even though Sinhalese parties had won Buddhist births. They won 40% of the vote in the North. They decided, let's forget the North. Let's not even campaign. So they won 40% of the votes. They didn't compete in one district in the North. And so this really means that, what does that mean? It means that you're going to get your majority only in, you're not going to pay any attention to minorities, as many people have to do in every district in India. You're going to only pay attention to getting a majority within the majority. So it really sets up a real majoritarian game. And that's what happened here. If we then talk about, and I could go through the other countries, some version of this happened everywhere. If we go through the question of territory, we will focus on Ceylon. In 1984, I'll just say something about the language thing. Even Bandaranaike realized that the language law was pretty extreme. So he made a pact with the major Tamil leader that softened the implementation of it. The monks were so furious with this that they campaigned outside of his house for over a week, and finally he went out and said, ripped it up, and this is filmed, ripped it up and said, I totally renounce it. Later he tried to do some other type of compromise, and the monks were so furious at him that, and this is really well documented by Manner in his biography of Kaviraj, that he was killed in a plot basically organized by a major monk because he wasn't Buddhist enough. And so this is, when you mobilize something like this, it's hard to demobilize it. Now, in 1984, this killing and other things set off the biggest riots ever in the history of Ceylon, 1984. In that context, instead of softening anything, it was an amazing effort to call a special session of Congress and to ask and to write a new law and ask every single member of the Congress to pledge that they absolutely will always support a unitary state in Sri Lanka and never allow any form of secessionism. Now, to put this in comparative perspective, you know this, but let's just think with it. The Sri Lankan demand, this demand that you couldn't be in the parliament unless you swore this. Scottish nationalists in the United Kingdom advocate independence and they're in the parliament. The Parti Québécois in Canada advocates independence and they help form the government. Convergencia in Union in Catalonia and Spain wants independence and they form the government. And Vlaanderen and Belgium are the same and they remain in the legislature. However, in Ceylon, they asked every single legislature to go up and pledge allegiance, and every single one, and whatever, individually, and every single, I talked to many people who did this, they just couldn't do it, pledge that unitary state when they knew devolution was necessary. So they put down their hand and they walked out the door. By the last person had walked out, there wasn't another person in the Sri Lankan parliament who represented Tamils from the north for the next 25 years. Not a single person. Now this had a huge impact. And I talked to 2 of the 7 major leaders of guerrilla forces. And they both told me independently the same story. That they watched this. And they knew about it. And the impact on them was, hey, that's it. Our leaders, our natural leaders are gone. We have no say. So we're going to have to, if we want to do anything, we're going to have to go to the jungle. So they went to the jungle and they recruited people. And they insisted that their ability to recruit was vastly increased by the fact that all the leaders had been thrown out. Okay, let me just conclude with some thoughts on speculation about the non-imagined and some imaginable countries among these three Theravada Buddhist countries. Can we imagine anything that's different? And if people can't imagine it, that's really important for us to understand. Because that really says something about the branching hegemony if you can't even conceive of it. Okay? Now, the waging of a civil war in Sri Lanka between 1983 and 2009 led to the erosion of democracy among both Sinhalese Buddhists and Tamil Hindus. But at the moment, authoritarian attitudes and structures among the Sinhalese are the most inhibiting of redemocratization. Sri Lanka's civil war only ended with the death, only ended with the military victory of the Sinhalese nationalist leader, President Rajapaksa. Now, the victory, if anything, made him even more aggressively supportive of majoritarian and military state future for Sri Lanka. In an interview with N. Ram, then the editor of The Hindu, who gave him 3 long interviews, and if you're interested in this, read it, because it's really stark. He said, "My theory is there are no minorities in Sri Lanka. There are only those who love the country and those that don't. The people have given me the mandate, so I'm going to use it. No way for federalism to happen in this country," unquote. That's an Enron interview, tape recorded. Now, the Sri Lankan army, which is routinely called by themselves the Sinhalese army, I just don't know, they just slip into that vocabulary in my interviews. They call it the Sinhalese army, was just a triumphalist. They posted signs in Sinhalese to the entry to the largest Tamil Hindu city, Jaffna, asserting "one nation, one state." That's a big sign as you walk in. And it's then this Sinhalese army vehicular barracks in Hindu majority Jaffna, with soldiers in it, and a number of these, and I have photographs of this, have painted a long pink Buddha asserting "only Buddha sleeps here." Now, if that's the way to start mending a nation after a long civil war, well, it's totally triumphalist. Now, I think the guerrilla war probably intensified majoritarianism and intolerant political attitudes among Sinhalese Buddhists. In 2004, I worked a bit with Yogendra and one of them is crafting questions for a census-based survey of the 5,227 respondents in India and 4,613 in Sri Lanka. Some comparative results of direct relevance for our lecture and conversation tonight are the following. Only 48% of Indian Hindus strongly agree that, quote, in a democracy, the will of the majority must prevail. But 89% of Sri Lankan Buddhists sign on that they agree that the will of the majority must prevail. It's a very majoritarian culture. Also, whereas in India, among both Hindus and Muslims, the greater the intensity, we have this, the greater the intensity of religious practice, the greater the support for democracy. In Sri Lanka, for Buddhists, the greater the intensity of religious practice, the less the support for democracy. The difference between the two is like that. So something bad has happened to the culture, and it's going to take a lot of work. Among Sri Lankan Buddhists, the whole question of as we talk here, polities with deep diversity among language, religion, and ethnic groups adopt a form of asymmetrical federalism, where some units of the polity may be granted more or different powers, say, over education or language than other units. But, and I think asymmetrical federalism eventually will have to be used if they want a democracy. Such an asymmetrical proposal was robustly rejected by 82% of the Sinhalese Buddhists. So they're majoritarian, they reject any of the normal things that you do. And so, 5 years after the Civil War ended, the president continued its intolerant, authoritarian, un-Buddha, un-Ashoka-like ways. For Buddha, mutually respectful dialogue is crucial for a harmonious society. It gives me no pleasure at all to end my conversation about Ceylon with the fact that the 2013 Committee to Protect Journalists ranks Sri Lanka as the country in the world with the 4th worst record in the world for crimes against journalists committed with impunity. It's a really hard, hostile environment to talk about many of these issues.